check to see if the exhaust valve is set properly. This is the exhaust valve. This is the exhaust line barb, hose barb here. You can take your fingers and move this collar that I have my pencil going on. It should be rigid. You shouldn't get any movement in there, which means the exhaust valve is hard up against the exhaust seat. When you bring the float down and open it, you'll be able to see a little bit of movement in the collar now, which means it's free and the exhaust valve is off the seat. We have a complete listing of parts for this pump on our website and breakdowns if you're curious about what this looks like inside here. We're not going to take it apart, and normally it's never not taken apart during normal cleaning. Now that we have the pump thoroughly checked out, it's a good idea now to show you how to clean the pump. It needs to be cleaned occasionally. Sometimes it will stop operating due to precipitation and debris buildup inside the pump. Typically it's on the control rod, the discharge tube, and in and on inside the float. To remove the bottom T-weldment, the first thing we're going to do, you remove these hairpin pins. And then remove the two Carter clevis pins. The bottom weldment can then be removed. You have 3 retaining ring springs on the float. This keeps the control rod from falling out of the slot in the pump. They're easily removed by hand. Just squeeze the little ends together and then move them down the float and off. The control rod now can be pulled out of the slot, swung over, and pulled off. It's sort of like a shepherd's hook on the end. Be careful not to bend this when you clean it. You can remove the float. You can clean the float with detergents, Alkanox, even solvents, and use wire brushes on it, but don't use a pressure washer. The drop tube or the discharge tube needs to be cleaned. And when you have this unit stripped down, this is basically your field stripped version of the pump. No further disassembly is normally required. You want to make sure that your control arm, it moves very freely, should not be in a bind. If it isn't stiff, just work it back and forth, not necessarily take it apart. Just work it to where and move the axle back and forth here and get it to work free. And as long as it's free, it functions very well. Okay, now we're going to put the unit back together. We put the float back on. We take the shepherd's hook, the control rod, run it through the rib here, and put it into the groove in the float. Put the 3 springs back on. Being careful not to hyperextend the spring. You know, when you open it up with your fingers, don't get too rambunctious with it. Open it up too big. If you lose one of these springs, you can actually, the unit will work just fine with one. If you only end up with one, you need to put that in the middle groove. Put 3 on here because that way you do have that insurance in case you lose or damage one when you're cleaning it. Okay, when we put the bottom T-weldment on, slide it on, make sure the control rod goes through the bushing hole. Get it flush with the end. discharge tube. Align the holes and put your clevis pins in. Put your keepers back on your clevis pins. Now the best way you put the pump body back on, slide it on, be careful not to hit anything as you slide it back on. You don't want to hit this pump float and jam it up in here hard. You want to make sure you clear the pump body, clears the control rod and control arm. Now the best thing to do, especially with a bottom load pump, is to stand the pump on its end, on its head. Make sure to put this check valve, your valve, or you'll be taking this thing back apart. Put it in. Visibly line up these two holes with the two threaded holes in the weldment tee. The two longer bolts, screws go in, and you can feel them go into a recess in that weldment, that bottom weldment tee, and tighten them, get them started with your fingers. Tighten them up with your nut driver or open end wrench. You don't have to be extremely, don't have to be extremely tight, but tighten them down evenly. If you have a screen, when you got your bottom load only pump, put it back on, put your screw in for your screen retaining, and tighten it up. The pump has 3 connections that have to be made in the field. Your air supply, which we've already shown, uses a 1/4 inch OD tube, needs to be cut square to the edge. The exhaust cartridge has a hose barb in it. It is a push-on and it does not require a hose clamp if you use the right tubing size. That tubing size is 3/8 OD, 5/16 ID. The discharge hose barb is meant for 1/2 inch OD tube or hose, and Durham Geoslope Indicator sells all the tube and hoses for this pump. You have a retaining clip here to put a cable on, which we highly recommend, so that you can pull hard on it in case you get the pump stuck. At this time, you're ready to put the pump in the well into service. That's it.